Greetings, digital world. Welcome back once again to another episode of Spliced In Later, where today it's business as usual as we talk once again about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We do this because I've run out of movies to review. When I say I run out of movies, there are movies that I could review. No, I have not seen Elvis yet. Please stop asking. I'll get around to it maybe in the next 5 years or so. But we'll continue finding some content to release on a weekly basis, and what better thing to continue on with than our ongoing look into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. If you're frequent listeners to this YouTube, to this Spotify, or if you're brand new, it's worth noting that this is the thing that we talk about the most on here because it's my favorite franchise to come out of movies, out of Star Wars, Star Trek, Indiana Jones, Mission Impossible, Lord of the Rings, all of that stuff. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is my favorite because I am just in awe of it as a concept, of how it has unfolded, how it has evolved, and how successful it has been. As I said many times before, we've had superhero movies before the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so plenty of Marvel films, plenty of Spider-Man films, Batman and Superman films have been around for quite some time. But the concept of a universe set up of different films from different franchises that establish a world that can all exist simultaneously with one another and cross over when needed was something that back in 2011, I was like, this is not going to work. I'm here for it. I'm interested to see how they try, but it's just not possible. How are people going to get involved in these characters that no one's ever heard about unless you've read the Marvel comics? How are people going to understand all the crisscrossing plot points? How are they going to combine all these big names from different trilogies and bring them together for team-ups? We say that now as we're crossing into the 30s when it comes to how many MCU films have been made, plus all the TV shows. Quite recently, Comic-Con announced their Phase 5 and Phase 6, or at least a few Phase 6 movies. So at least until 2025, this franchise isn't going away anytime soon. It's just getting bigger. Whether it can maintain its level of quality or whether it will collapse under its own ambition remains to be seen. But for me, it doesn't really matter. I will take in the content regardless. I can recognize whether it's good or not so good, but I'm not going to get mad at it or anything like that. Because at the end of the day, the Infinity Saga, the story that they told from 2008's Iron Man all the way to Avengers Endgame, and in retrospect, the epilogue with Spider-Man Far From Home, was a definitive story about the rise and fall of Thanos that was perfectly built up with all these different stories and characters, and was a payoff that was genuinely exciting, entertaining, and was a payoff that was satisfactory, I think, on many levels. So we'll see. But as part of this series, we attack it from two fronts. We either review the new stuff that's coming out, which has just been constant since 2021. We've had so many movies come out now, plus all the TV shows that are on Disney+. So normally, once I've seen the movie or I've seen the complete series of a TV show, I go and I review it. I talk about it, whether it was good or not, anything like that. Or we've been going back to the very beginning and we've been working our way through the evolution of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So we have completed a look at all the Phase 1 films. We've just started on Phase 2, so we've looked at Iron Man 3. And for this retrospective, I include all the TV shows that Kevin Feige and the powers that be would like to say is no longer canon. But at the time that these things were made, they were considered canon and they were worked to implement them into the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a whole. Which means we have looked at Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and we will be looking at the Netflix shows and the Freeform shows and the Hulu shows and all the stuff that's come out since then. So today we are looking at the second film in Phase 2, the second film in the Thor trilogy, Thor: The Dark World. If you caught the tail end of my Prey review, you will have heard me say that this is my least favorite of the MCU films. Now, when I say it's least favorite, that doesn't mean I don't like it. There's not an MCU thing I don't like. There are some that I enjoy a lot more than others, some that frustrate me, some that wow me, but at the end of the day, it's all just content, and I'm here for it regardless. But that being said, least favorite means there's still a ranking system, and whenever I take the time to rank all the MCU products, which is fairly frequently, especially whenever a new movie and a TV show come out. This film, Thor the Dark World, is always at the bottom. There's just no contest. And we'll explain why as we go into it. If you, for some reason, are listening to this episode having not watched Thor the Dark World and have no interest in watching Thor the Dark World and don't care about Marvel Cinematic Universe, hi, what are you doing here? Feel free. I mean, thanks for sticking around. But anyway, so Thor the Dark World, it was the sequel to Thor, and it was part of the next phase of MCU once that Avengers mammoth idea had been accomplished. Before the Avengers, the goal was, after the success of Iron Man and his successful cameo in The Incredible Hulk, we want to make our Avengers film, but we want to introduce all our characters beforehand. So we'll have our own Thor film, we'll have our own Captain America film, we'll plant Black Widow and Hawkeye and Nick Fury and all these other characters into these films so they can all combine into the Avengers. And if we're lucky, it will be successful. Not only was it successful, it was very competently made, and it of course made a lot of money. So the goal after that was, okay, now we're going to look to the future. We planned our little post-credit scene with Thanos at the end of the Avengers. We know we want to get to the Infinity Saga and the Infinity Stones. So now as we make these other movies, we've got to start planting the Infinity Stones. We've got to start introducing more characters. We've got to make more films with different leading actors. We've got to build on it. But we're still in the early days. We still want to get people in these seats. We want to make money. So the safest thing we can do is make trilogies out of our current successful franchises. Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr., incredibly charismatic and appealing. Successfully, Iron Man 3 was the first step in that. The fallout of Avengers and building towards the eventual Thanos Infinity Saga conflict. It was a good wrap up to Iron Man's solo stories, while still hinting that he had a bigger role to play in the larger world. Hulk, the Incredible Hulk, wasn't very successful critically. I think they came to the realization that Hulk works better as an ensemble. But Thor and Captain America, they were moderately successful at the box office. Everybody liked Chris Hemsworth as Thor and Chris Evans as Captain America. So right on, let's get right into establishing the trilogies, get as much movies out of them as we can before we really start delving into our lesser knowns, our Guardians of the Galaxy, our Ant-Man, Doctor Strange, Black Panther, all these things we've got planned. We'll get to them once we keep building on these current established franchises. Of the two of them, Captain America, I think, had more of a plan of what they wanted to do, where his character was going to go and how his stories would impact the MCU as a whole. But Thor had issues. Now, Thor, when people look back at the Thor franchise, especially at what Thor has become since Taika Waititi has taken over his stories and the way of developing his character, the way Chris Hemsworth has changed his portrayal of the role from tragic Shakespearean actor to Big Lebowski 80s rock god, the whole vibe and feel of Thor has changed, and that's fine. As I said in my Thor Love and Thunder review, sometimes the humor outweighs the actual seriousness of the story, but Chris Hemsworth's comedic timing is great, and his movies are very enjoyable from Thor Ragnarok onwards. With Thor the Dark World, obviously the knee-jerk reaction was to fit the vibe and the storytelling and all the characters that had been introduced in that first Thor film. We have to build on them, but in a way that Avengers has happened. So it can't be a direct sequel to Thor because Loki, the villain of Thor, was such an important part of the Avengers movie. So you can't jump into Thor 2, Thor the Dark World, and just be like, here's the fallout from Thor. You've got to include Avengers and all of that. But a lot of characters were left in a certain place in Thor that they have to continue their story while addressing the fact that they weren't an important part of the Avengers. Specifically, Thor's romantic interest and love story with Natalie Portman's Jane Foster, who in Avengers was just not around. They scurried her away. Thor had ended with Thor trapped in Asgard. He had destroyed the Rainbow Bridge and the Bifrost and all of that to stop Loki from destroying Earth. And the implication was he could never go back to Earth. But Jane Foster, their love would prevail and they'd find a way to each other again. Of course, though, they had to get Thor in for the Avengers movie, so they wrote that away with Odin summoned some dark magic and was able to send Thor to Earth. Why he didn't check in on Jane, I guess he really had to deal with Loki. There just wasn't time. So Thor: The Dark World opens with the Bifrost has been destroyed, but Thor has been not destroyed. I apologize. Has been rebuilt, but Thor has a lot to do with righting the mayhem of the galaxy, of the 9 realms that has happened because Asgard has been cut off from the rest of the world. So he's traveling around with Lady Sif and the Warriors 3. They're going to all these different places and trying to clean things up. Meanwhile, Loki has been placed in prison in Asgard. Loki continues to be the best thing about the Thor world and the Thor franchise, despises his adoptive father Odin, but they work on building some sort of relationship between him and his adoptive mother Frigga. They show that there's more to Loki than just mustache twirling villain. Meanwhile, on Earth in London, Jane Foster is doing some science. She's a bit sad about Thor. I used to think this was the saddest a woman could be, that she didn't have her man, until Wonder Woman 1984 came out and times that by 1,000. But she's investigating some stuff. She's still got her annoying intern Darcy. Dr. Selvig is in a mental institution after having his mind invaded by Loki. She finds some weird stuff going on which accidentally transports her to a strange place where she absorbs this thing called the Ether, which eventually is revealed to be the Reality Stone, one of the Infinity Stones. Doing that awakens Christopher Eccleston's Malekith, the king of the Dark Elves. Now, the Dark Elves are a race that want darkness. That's their whole thing. They want darkness, and they want to use the Reality Stone to do that. So they zero in on Jane to go get it. Thor realizes what is happening, whisks her away to Asgard to protect her, where they have some unresolved tension and issues. The Dark Elves attack Asgard, cause some destruction, kill an important character, to a point where, in order to stop Malekith, Thor has to team up with Loki. They have to go on an adventure with Jane to stop him. And then there's things ensue, and Thor ends off facing off against a Malekith in the usual Marvel good guy versus bad guy, big CGI punch fest. Obviously, things will work out because Thor's already promised to be in Avengers 2, Avengers Age of Ultron. But the movie at least leaves us on an interesting hook in terms of Loki's place in the world and what his intentions were as a character. But because Thor Ragnarok was completely revamped and redone due to the poor reception to this movie, Taika Waititi takes over, changes the whole idea of what Thor Ragnarok was going to be, turned it into the Planet Hulk storyline as well, put more humor into it. That means that eventually the cliffhanger that comes out of this movie really doesn't go anywhere and has no payoff other than just for a cheap laugh at the start of Thor Ragnarok. And that basically is Thor: The Dark World. Now, in its defense, Dark World had some behind-the-scenes issues. Of the Phase 2 films, it is the most directionless. I will say Age of Ultron is slightly better, but has the same sort of issue where the goal was obviously Thanos in the Infinity Saga, but Phase 2 obviously wasn't going to rush to get there, and needed to come up with something to spend some time on. So we had our throwaway villain Ultron for Age of Ultron. Dark World, even then, I don't think they were certain what they were going to do with the Infinity Stones. They knew to throw the term out so people would know what to do with it. But in terms of this movie's impact on the rest of the saga, it's very minimal. As I said, the Loki thing ends up being nothing. And aside from that, the only other thing is we learn that there has been more than one Infinity Stone in the MCU so far. But, you know, it was important that nothing changed because Thor had important roles to play in upcoming Avengers team-ups. Loki was needed for certain plans in the future as well. So really, it was just sort of, we need to make a second Thor film because it will make money and we need to have content, and the big three need their trilogies, but we don't really know what we want to do, or we don't even really know if we want to change things because of to make Thor more interesting, or how all these characters and all this world actually play into the broad scheme of things. Unlike, say, looking at when I eventually talk about the Winter Soldier, the impact of S.H.I.E.L.D. and everything that happened with that had a lasting effect going forward. Or whether it was introducing new characters like the Guardians or Ant-Man, or finishing up a story like Iron Man. Thor: The Dark World is just this middle child that just sort of exists. And when you go through and you watch all the Thor films, because of the drastic change in the Thor vibe and feel, this movie sort of stands out separate. Thor at least establishes the first Thor establishes the character, the world, all of that stuff. And even though his personality has changed from that first Thor film, it has the benefit of introducing the characters and the world. Dark World doesn't introduce any characters that last further on. Nobody is changed, apart from a certain death in this movie, which I would argue doesn't really have any weight until it's revisited in Avengers Endgame. Everybody is still exactly where they were when the movie began. It's also very short, so it doesn't give you a lot of time to flesh out a lot of the characters, which leads us to Malekith the Accursed, our big bad for the movie, Christopher Eccleston. When we look at the worst villains in the MCU, Malekith, it's no contest. Malekith is always included in this list. He is a nothing character. He is bad guy that needs to do bad things. He's a dark elf that wants darkness. But that's about it. He does villainous things because the movie needs him to do it. But when you stack him up with Loki, another villain from this franchise, and just the vast differences between them in character development and motivation and lasting impact, it really showcases the flaws that happen with Malekith. Aside from that, Malekith barely speaks. Christopher Eccleston played one of the doctors in Doctor Who. He's one of my favorite doctors. He has that personality and that gravitas as an actor to really make an interesting villain. And I was excited when they announced that Christopher Eccleston would be in this movie leading up to it. And then he really is he's nothing. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't say anything. If you didn't know it was Christopher Eccleston under that makeup, it wouldn't matter. And also the movie it's boring. It's boring. It's generic Marvel movie, but it doesn't have that satisfaction of knowing that things, the important points are happening that will lead to future Avengers Infinity Saga stuff. It is just, we need to make a Thor film. Here it is. The positives, there are some positives in here for sure. I think Chris Hemsworth is still great as Thor. The elements of what his eventual comedy persona are ever so slightly elaborated on here, mainly during the last act of the film, where he's teaming up with Jane and they're running around London trying to fight Malekith, and he's hanging his hammer up next to Coates when he goes around to Dr. Selvig's apartment, or he falls through a portal, ends up in underground, needs to get back to Greenwich, so he has to catch the train to get back to Greenwich. Just little moments of pretty clever fish out of water silly humor, which was eventually expanded on in a more effective way from that. Loki, still great. Everything going on with him, the fallout of him teaming up with the Chitauri, trying to kill all of Earth, how Odin feels about him, how Frigga feels about him, his reluctant team up with Thor, whether he does love his brother or not. There's so much going on in that performance, and Tom Hiddleston's portrayal of it, that any scene with him is a delight, especially when they have to team up together. That's about it. Aside from that, everybody else is in here. I like the world of Thor. I like Thor's side characters, specifically from Asgard. So the Warriors 3, Odin, Lady Sif, Heimdall. Heimdall gets to do some stuff in this movie, which he didn't get to do in the first Thor. But again, it's fleeting stuff because the movie is so short, and at the end of the day, they don't have anything really impactful to add to it. Lady Sif especially, she's been shortchanged even with the new Thor films. There's hints that there should be like a romantic relationship between her and Thor, or at least something there, but it's forgotten as soon as it's mentioned. And then Natalie Portman is great as Jane. I like her portrayal of it, and having seen her in Love and Thunder, I know that she always had the potential to produce an interesting character in Jane and have really good romantic chemistry with Chris Hemsworth. But she's relegated in this movie to jilted girlfriend and MacGuffin because she has the reality stone inside her and everybody's going after her. It's interesting to see her in Asgard and have her go through the fish out of water stuff. But again, it's not elaborated on enough. Dr. Selvig, I will say he's funny when he's hanging out in the mental asylum and he's just stealing Stanley's shoes. That's quite funny. But at the end of the day, The Dark World is an example of where the MCU could have gone wrong. They zigged when they should have zagged. And unlike all the other films that come after it, in 9 out of 10 cases, there is an overall goal. There's a purpose to each film. Thor: The Dark World, at least for me personally, screams obligatory sequel. Something that was on the board table coming up with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They went, all right, we need a Thor trilogy. Doesn't matter what happens in it. We just need Thor films for content, and nothing important can happen right now because we need to get past this to phase 3, which is the Infinity result of Thanos and all of that going on. It needs to be made to these specifications. It can't be. They were in the early days of MCU as well, so they weren't allowing directors to be too zany. Like in those early MCU days, you couldn't have a Taika Waititi film. You couldn't have a Sam Raimi film. I believe Patty Jenkins was up to direct The Dark World, and she left because she says that she was too restricted in what she was allowed to do with her vision of the film. And they replaced her with Alan Taylor. Now, Alan Taylor, fair enough, has directed some very well Game of Thrones episodes. Specifically, he's directed the episodes where there's big, giant battle scenes. But Alan Taylor is he's like the director for hire. We need somebody to direct this movie the way we need it to be done. Alan Taylor, he'll do it to these specifications. So that's it. I mean, The Dark World, I don't want to be too negative on it because I said I don't hate that it exists. I don't hate it, really. It's just disappointing. I remember when I saw it at the cinemas, I went to a midnight screening for it, and I was so excited. I was staying up till midnight, waiting in line to go in, and then it was sort of an afterthought. After the movie was over, I was like, okay, there's something nigged at me, in the same way that I'm sure something nigged at people who saw The Last Jedi and knew that it wasn't to what they expected it to be or what they wanted it to be. That's what Dark World was to me. The most enjoyable thing I had in the movie was I went and saw it with my friend. They had the opening scene where Odin's talking about darkness and the dark elves, and that the ether, the reality stone, had been hidden where no one could find it. And the shot pulled back, and the reality stone was in this rock, and the rock formed the O that became Thor: The Dark World, the title. And my friend leaned over to me and went, "That's a good hiding spot. I wouldn't think to look in the title." And that was dumb, but I laughed out loud at that. And that's probably the most enjoyment I had watching the film. I will rewatch it every time I go through all the MCU films and do my rewatches, but it's not a movie I look forward to watching. It's not a movie that I can really pull anything out of and say, this was really, really good. It's just generic movie. And it shows that if this same attitude had been approached to the next Captain America movie, to any sequels for Ant-Man, Guardians, Doctor Strange, anything like that, the MCU could have been just a very bland, mundane thing that was not allowing its ambitions and its potential to rise above, make generic movie for Hollywood for money. Dark World is a showcasing of that. That's why for me, it's always my least favorite Marvel Cinematic Universe movie, and only gets like a 6 from me. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed reminiscing of a very generic movie. I will be back next week. I've decided I'm going to talk about the new TV show, The Sandman, that just hit Netflix last week. I've had never read the Sandman comics when I watched it, but I did want to because it's connected loosely to DC comic characters that I'm familiar with, specifically John Constantine and Lucifer, because I've watched the Lucifer TV show. But even that, I was not prepared for the experience I had watching the TV show and the reaction I had to it, and all the different emotions and feelings I felt with the movies. The TV show, I apologize. Especially one particular episode which still sticks with me. So I decided I will talk about it. I don't know if it'll be particularly educated because I don't have that Sandman pre-knowledge. But you can get the opinion of somebody who knows nothing about the Sandman, whether they enjoyed it or not, and answers that age-old question, which I didn't realize was a question, but looking at reviews, which was, can people who aren't avid Sandman fans enjoy a Sandman adaptation? Short answer, yes, they can. Long answer will be explained next week. But until then, I love and appreciate you all as always. Thank you for tuning in for another episode. It is always a delight talking to you, and I will see you next time. Adios, muchachos. I'll catch you next time.